I would like to ask you a question. So basically, to answer that question, I was hoping to get your opinions on whether social media platforms are a corporate company or a civic space. Because at the moment, those I feel are the crux of our arguments when we're talking about how they should be moderated and how they should be regulated. There are some people that are like, oh, Facebook is a private company, so they have the right to do whatever they want. But there are other people that are saying, hey, actually, people express their views and share their stories on social media. So there is a form of civic space happening.
When we started to talk about trolls following in the aftermath of the 2016 US presidential election, we actually knew that this was, we didn't know these were trolls, but we knew that we had seen those automated publication tweets back in 2010 when we're looking at what was happening in a Western African country called Gabon, in which there were repression following uprising of the population in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And to counter the narrative around what was happening and to counter the fact that civil society organizations, citizens had found a space on Twitter and on Facebook, Twitter particularly, to tell what was really happening in a media environment that was completely locked for them. The government chose to buy bots, obviously. We started seeing people from India or from Turkey tweeting about what was happening in Gabon while not being there. This was weird, but at the time, honestly, we didn't know that this was automated propaganda.
Where we're trying to identify how we can adopt a more human rights-centric approach to content moderation, specifically for moderating online misinformation, online disinformation, online hate speech, and other aspects of speech which could potentially have real-world harms. Over the last few years, we're seeing a trend of platformization, where a majority of online speech today is passed on through a very select group of online intermediaries. With Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and their parent organizations governing most of our speech, we're noticing how even content moderation is becoming more and more centralized. For example, in Myanmar, we saw how Facebook wrongly took down accounts and took down content posted by victims of the genocide instead of taking down violent content by the perpetrators. In India, we're seeing how Facebook is allegedly very lenient towards taking down speech by the ruling party and is quite trigger happy in a lot of cases to take down content by activists, by students, etc. And there's a trend that we're seeing in content moderation on the whole.
That most conversations about technologies related to mental health in general or disability more broadly are rooted in carceral and ableist approaches to disability and to mental health. That is, technologies that exist to therapize us, to medicalize us, to pathologize us, to surveil us, and to criminalize us. Technologies that may ostensibly be for our own benefit. That is, perhaps we wish to detect if you are experiencing or about to experience a relapse of addiction or a more intensified episode of depression so that we can provide support to you. In theory, that could sound decent for like 2 seconds until you think about the implications for longer than 2 seconds. What does that mean about who has access to this data and what are they actually using it for? Because our whole lives are constantly considered as fodder for researchers, for therapists, for clinicians, for literally everybody except ourselves. Here's what I want to see happening. Not just are we consulting people with lived experience, but are the developers and the researchers listening to what people who are psych disabled, mad, neurodivergent, have mental illnesses, whatever language a particular person uses, are you listening to what we want for ourselves and our communities? And are your technologies, the ideas that you have that are even long before you get to prototyping, when you're still at the drawing board, are those ideas actually moving us closer to the goals expressed and articulated by the people who are the most impacted and who have the most to lose?
as we move more and more of our lives online, we're depending more and more on intermediaries to facilitate connection. So for example, we're all connected today on Zoom. Who knows what Zoom's going to do with this recording later on? I don't know. There is an expectation of privacy, but we still haven't, kind of as a society, as humans, we still haven't figured out good safeguards and also like community consensus around the extent to which we want to protect privacy. Coin Center has a really good paper on the case for electronic cash. They make the case for privacy in cash. So the difference between your physical coins or your physical dollar bills, even if they're super dirty and full of all kinds of drugs, they are private, and they're private by default. And that's not something you get with many digital services. No matter how secure they are, there's any number of ways, depending on your network security, your user behavior, there's any number of ways to leak metadata.
In the States, there have been a few measures to try to push back on the adoption of facial recognition use. The Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act is actually one of the strongest laws that we have in the States to help protect people's information and to help challenge sort of wholesale scraping of facial images. Different towns have banned the use of facial recognition technology, often until there can be further study done. California has also banned facial recognition use, specifically on police body cameras.
So in the EU, in December 2020, the European Union launched the long-anticipated Digital Services Act, which is the new regulation that aims to establish a systemic model of regulation of online platforms. The DSA distinguishes between, in its scope, between online platforms and something we nowadays call VLOP, which stands for very large online platforms. And many call this type of regulation a new generation of the content governance and a new form of regulation in that regard. If we have a look at what has been happening at the EU level and also at the member states level until arrival of DSA, we can see that these were all silver bullet solutions in the form of national legislative proposals trying to regulate online actors and the way how they actually then consequently regulate speech. And these usually relied on requirements to swiftly remove piece of user-generated content, often encouraging platforms to deploy so-called proactive measures, so automated decision-making processes, whether within the content moderation or whether even through the content curation through something that we call shadow banning, so how the content has been often demonetized or somehow not actually amplified enough by the platforms. And this way, the states were actually aiming at holding platforms responsible and at the same time shifting the traditional positive obligation of state to protect individual rights of users. That's why DSA is sort of a new generation in that regard, because it doesn't focus strictly on the concrete categories of illegal content or illegal conduct, but it actually focuses on processes that are being deployed by these platforms. It places emphasis on meaningful transparency. It set forward the new requirements for meaningful transparency that go beyond the pure metrics, so how much content and how fast it was removed, but also what kind of tools are actually platforms using and what is the logic and reasoning behind using those tools.